Hi everyone, my name is Megan, and today I'm going to be talking about linguistic relativity, intercultural communication between Israeli Jews and Palestinians, and interpretation and translation. Linguistic relativity is a really interesting concept for me. Over the course of my grad school experience, I've heard a lot of negative comments about the subject in general, but I do find it pretty fascinating still. The idea of linguistic relativity relates to the way our language impacts or does not impact the way we think. First, we have the nominalist position, which states that our language is only an expression of our perception and thoughts. Those who adopt the nominalist theory believe that everyone sees the world in roughly the same way, and the variation in language has no bearing on what we see. For example, a tree is a tree, regardless of whether or not you call it a tree or an árbol, as you do in Spanish. A good way to remember the principles of this theory is the famed Shakespeare quote from Romeo and Juliet: "What's in a name? A rose by any other name would smell as sweet." That pretty much sums up the nominalist theory. Next, we have the relativist position. This position is based on the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which was developed in the 1930s and 40s, and it states that our thoughts and perceptions are directly correlated with our language. Supporters of this theory point to grammar constructions and vocabulary to identify how languages may determine the way we think about the world. One of the most famous examples of this is Whorf's analysis of the Inuit vocabulary used to describe snow. Some argue that there are as many words for snow in English as there are in the Inuit language, while others argue that the semantic variation within the words describe a different point of view on each version of snow. Finally, the qualified relativist position lands us somewhere in the middle between these two extremes. The qualified relativist position is also referred to as the weak version of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and it allows for more nuance in the discussion of the relationship between thought and language. Qualified relativist theorists assert that the meaning of our words depends on an underlying framework of basic cognitive concepts. When investigating the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, there are three areas of research that do not work in favor of the strong version of this hypothesis. The first of these areas is the study of language acquisition in children. If the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis were true, children would not be able to think without first acquiring language. Several psychologists have long wrestled with this question, and although the findings aren't definitive, the conclusions do not demonstrate a strong indication that language influences thought or vice versa. Second, cross-cultural differences in language present a problem for the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. The textbook references the difference between the Russian and English words for the color blue. While English has one word to describe all shades of blue, Russian differentiates between light shades and dark shades. While Russian speakers may be able to more quickly identify a difference between a light shade of blue and a dark shade of blue in their language, this is really only a matter of how quickly the colors can be categorized. Finally, researchers look toward the cognition of children who are deaf to determine the relationship between thought and language. There are two important observations collected from this research. The first being that hearing children and deaf children demonstrated the same cognitive capacity despite their language and short-term memory discrepancies. This indicates that the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis does not hold up in this study. However, it was discovered that hearing children could navigate spatial questions more quickly than deaf children, which indicates that language organizes our thoughts. Again, this is a question of speed and not so much a question of perception. The concept of linguistic relativity and time is one that I find extremely fascinating and very complicated. In a research study conducted by Lira Boroditsky and Alice Gaby, a group of Australian Aboriginals from Pormpuraaw were found to have a perception of time unlike any other community on the planet. In their study, they compared the Pormpuraans' perception of time with that of the Americans' perception of time, and found that the Pormpuraans' perception is directly linked with cardinal direction. While this is certainly different from the American way of thinking, it's not that surprising, considering their language is uniquely influenced by cardinal direction. Pormpuraans often greet each other by asking, "Where are you going?" and expect a very literal answer, such as, "I'm going northeast," or "I'm going southwest," or something like that. When we apply this concept to their perception of time, it's entirely possible that their language is influencing the way they understand time. When the Pormpuraans were facing south in the observation room during the study, they would indicate time as moving from left to right, just like we do as Americans. However, when they were facing east, they indicated time as moving towards themselves, or from far away to nearby for us Americans. As opposed to most other language speakers where time is depicted as moving in the same direction as our writing, like from left to right in English or from up to down in Chinese, the Pormpuraans view time as a fixed concept grounded by the movement of the sun. Okay, now we are going to shift gears a little bit and talk about transformative communication, specifically between Israeli Jews and Palestinians. I found this article really interesting, especially because it identified the difference in speech codes between the Israeli Jews and the Palestinians. The Israeli Jewish speech code, called Dugri, is characterized by assertiveness and directness, and emphasizes the importance of individual clarity, whereas Musaira, the speech code for Palestinians, is characterized by repetition, indirectness, and elaboration, which are all employed in an effort to be polite and non-confrontational. You can see right away how these speech codes clash, and having each group employ their own speech code in a dialogue with one another would most likely lead to a pretty severe clash in culture, which is possibly how the deep-seated conflict came about to begin with. Fortunately, the article did indicate that these speech codes are not unyielding, and the Palestinians demonstrated an ability to break from their speech code in an effort to be assertive in their claims with the Palestinians. Another really crucial aspect of this article was the contact hypothesis, which states that under certain conditions, contact between groups in conflict reduces prejudice and changes negative intergroup attitudes. These conditions, under which the contact hypothesis works, are: the two groups must have equal status. They must have personal and sustained communication. They must engage in cooperative activities where each group depends on the other for a successful outcome. And they must live in a society where the social norms promote equality. It turns out that the contact hypothesis has proved successful in more situations than just this one. In a study of children between the ages 13 and 15 in Wales and England, researchers set out to counter anti-Muslim sentiments among these Christian or religiously affiliated teens. The research found that students who followed the guidelines of the contact hypothesis were less likely to be fearful or prejudiced against Muslim neighbors. They were more likely to support wearing Muslim clothing in school, and were even interested in learning more about Muslim culture and the religion of Islam. The contact hypothesis highlights a crucial factor that leads to a lot of divisiveness and prejudice around the world. We are afraid of what we don't understand. I'd like to preface this next part by saying I do not believe the contact hypothesis would solve the deep-rooted systemic issues that our nation still faces today. However, with that being said, I do wonder if the contact hypothesis tells us something about why racial tensions are still so prevalent in the United States. Segregation is the antithesis of the contact hypothesis, and I'd like to theorize that the remnants of segregation in this country only further divide the nation, as racial groups still tend to live in bubbles across the country. I think it's entirely possible that the physical distance that stands between races causes ignorance and literally blind hatred. Again, I'm not saying that having a black friend or a Hispanic friend or an Asian friend exempts anyone from being a racist. But I do think if we were able to more thoroughly integrate with one another, our society would naturally be more tolerant of others. Or at least that's what the contact hypothesis states. This is a pretty utopian idea, though, and as we've learned in previous weeks, culture can be pretty messy, and humans have a tendency to cling to the familiar and attempt to put people into certain categories in an attempt to understand those that are different than us. I brought up this idea because a little town not too far from Georgia State, has been considered one of the most diverse towns in the country. Clarkston, Georgia, has been named the Ellis Island of the South, and not only boasts residents from across the globe, including several refugees from various countries, they also boast an extremely low crime rate and an extremely low poverty rate. I wonder if Clarkston is our shining example of what the contact hypothesis could do for the nation as a whole. I'd like to talk a little bit about translation and interpretation. This was only a small section in the book, but I think it highlights a pretty important aspect of intercultural communication. I'm also a little biased because I did work in the translation department at the Latin American Association, so I know a little bit about what translators have to go through in order to navigate cultural differences. Translators and interpreters are challenged to produce both an accurate and roughly equivalent meaning in a new target language from the source language. As we can see from the example of the Israeli Jews and the Palestinians, interpreters in this situation would probably have a pretty difficult time separating the meaning of what's being said from the cultural perspective through which it's said, and then manipulating that same message and pushing it through yet another entirely different cultural lens to end up with the same equivalency on both ends. The book calls this facet of the job cultural brokerage, and it indicates that much more is required than knowledge of two or more languages in order to adequately translate or interpret one language to another. The book also suggests that intercultural communication specialists may be key players in the attempt to redefine translation studies. I think this is a truly important aspect of intercultural communication due to the huge impact a miscommunication can have. A famous example of this is Nikita Khrushchev's statement directed to the Western ambassadors during the height of the Cold War. His personal interpreter determined that his phrase in English would translate to, "We will bury you," which became international headlines, and many Americans perceived it as a threat of nuclear war. Decades later, linguists reanalyzed the statement and determined that it's more likely that Khrushchev was attempting to say something along the lines of, "We will be present at your funeral," or "We will outlive you," in reference to his communist ideals and society. This is a perfect example of how knowing two languages does not necessarily make you qualified to interpret or translate. Knowledge of another culture and the implication of the words is essential to preventing any kind of disaster, especially a global nuclear catastrophe. I would be remiss if I did not bring one of my favorite movies of all time into our discussion of linguistic relativism and the troubles of translation and interpretation. Arrival is a science fiction movie directed by Denis Villeneuve that was released in 2016. In the movie, aliens arrive on Earth, and the United States military calls on a professor of linguistics, Louise Banks, to assist with an attempt to communicate with the aliens. Already, it's a pretty fascinating concept, but trust me, it gets better. In the movie, we are able to see how several countries handle their attempt to communicate with the aliens. At one point in the movie, Louise learns that the Chinese are attempting to communicate with the aliens through the game Mahjong and have interpreted one of the alien symbols to mean weapon, based on what they've learned through their translation method. She argues that by attempting to translate the alien's language through a game, you automatically pit two sides against one another and force conflict, even if the aliens have no intention of causing a conflict. Albeit pretty abstract, I think it's a fascinating look at why interpretation and translation can be so delicate and must be handled with care and an understanding of culture. Although an understanding of the alien culture would have been impossible in this case. I guess that's why they call it science fiction. Anyway, more than this glimpse of translation, though, Arrival's central theme revolves around linguistic relativity. Without giving too much of the movie away, Louise spends her time working on solving this communication problem by attempting to translate the aliens' written language. Eventually, Louise starts to think in their language, and her perception of time shifts. It's a fascinating concept, and it does align with the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. So, if you have the opportunity to watch it, I would highly recommend it. It is pretty dramatic, and again, it is science fiction, but it's a science fiction movie with a professional linguist as the protagonist. What's not to love? Lastly, I would like to encourage everyone to watch the TED Talk by Lera Boroditsky, the researcher who worked with the prawns in Australia. She gives several examples of how language influences our thought and makes some compelling arguments for the qualified relativism theory.